and also like to acknowledge all First Nations people across the many countries that make up Australia and their commitment and connection to land, water and communities. So on behalf of the University of Melbourne and all the attendees today, we honour the rich cultural heritage and the spiritual practices of all First Nations people, and that those practices continue to shape and enrich our world. We're committed to learning from their wisdom and understanding their knowledge and fostering mutual respect and understanding as always. So welcome everyone. We've picked up a few more since I did the acknowledgements. So I'm Ross Nevant. I'm the Program Director for the University of Melbourne's development of the Carbon Farming Outreach Training Package for DQ. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Richard Eckard, who will be our main speaker, Dr. Selwyn Helbron, who was one of the academic leads that supported Richard and I in the development of the program, and also Associate Professor Tangerine Holt, who's provided oversight and guidance on the program since 2023. So today's webinar is titled Carbon Calculators 101, What are the similarities and what is best practice? It's a really important topic. It's the second of 3 webinars, as I mentioned. And these webinars are designed and presented specifically for you guys, the grantees of the Carbon Farming Outreach Program for DQ. So in this webinar, Professor Richard Eckard, who you all know is a leader in climate research in agriculture, will speak about several really important topics to think about when you're using or working through calculators and what they're all about. The first one is that why we need carbon accounting, followed by a section on mandatory climate-related financial disclosures, which has become very topical lately, and we all know why. Rich will then lead into carbon footprints and explaining the difference between carbon footprints and carbon accounting. We'll then head through the principles of greenhouse gas accounting and look more closely at scopes 1, 2 and 3, how they apply to on-farm activities. And then we'll step into what a typical greenhouse gas farm profile looks like and dive into carbon accounting frameworks and the tools. Finish up by having a look at something that we haven't really covered previously, and that's measuring carbon footprints in the agri-food products. And that's where Selwyn will be invaluable if you've got questions later on, because Selwyn is a specialist in food and fibre and supply chain when it comes to environmental accounting. So if you've got any specific questions about that, Selwyn should be able to step in and help us answer those. And then the final part of this is looking at future challenges. So we've got all the right people in the right places to talk to you about this today, so it's going to be a great talk. Now, look, we hope that you guys, as DQ's trusted advisors, can really use the knowledge that you gained today, along with the resources that the University of Melbourne has provided to DQ in the training package and the facilitation guide. And we hope this can support your working with farmers and land managers to explore their options for adopting carbon positive farming management practices. So just a bit of housekeeping. The presentation will probably run through until around about, or for another 45 minutes. We'll then take a 15-minute break because we're looking at a 2-hour session in total if question time blows out. So a 15-minute break, and then Selwyn and Richard and the DQ team will be available to respond to any questions that you might have. And you can also put the way that we want to run the Q&A, a little similar to last time, is pop your questions in the chat and you're welcome to do that as Rich is presenting. And then we'll go through those after the break. And unlike last time, what we will do is allow you guys to unmute yourself. So if your question is being addressed by Rich or the team, please feel free to join the discussion or respond to any questions or clarifications that our team might ask. But we're just very mindful also that we want to give everyone a fair go, and we don't want anyone to soapbox or grandstand too much with anything. And I know it's very unlikely to happen. I'm just saying let's be mindful that we've got a large group of people here today, and we want to give everyone a chance to engage with our team and particularly with Richard. So just to note also that today's webinar is being recorded, so that will be available to you guys through DQ at a later stage. And that's about it from me. So I'll pass over to Zoe from DQ. She's got a few words about the program and today's event. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ross. I'll be quick. I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and in particular pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people from whose land I'm joining from today. So as Ross said, welcome to our second of 3 webinars. I'm Zoe Booker and I work in the Commonwealth Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water on the CFOP program. So the webinar is intended to provide additional supplementary information to support you, as Ross said, in delivering the CFOP into your communities and diving deeper into relevant topics. It's not an expectation that you need to walk out of today's session with a full technical understanding of the content presented, but it's rather just to give you further information, tools and knowledge to continue to provide guidance and support as you're doing. And of course, these sessions are optional and not mandatory. And as Ross said, they're recorded as well. So you'll have that as a record if you would like to watch them at a later date. Last thing I will just say is that I hope you find them informative and useful. And I'll pass to Richard. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, Zoe. Thank you, Ross. And hi, everyone. I see a few names in common from some of the sessions we've had previously. Welcome back. I said I would do a deeper dive into carbon calculators. What do we mean by carbon calculators? What are the similarities between the calculators that are emerging? And what's best practice? So let's jump into the topic. Always start with why we need this. Why do we need carbon accounting? Well, we know mandatory reporting is coming. It's not even just on its way to us, it's already here. So international financial reporting standards that now have the S2 climate-related disclosure standard incorporated, and a number of countries that you can see on the screen there have adopted this and are starting to move into this space. So in Australia's case, I'll get to that in a moment. Now, this doesn't just affect the countries, it affects companies reporting within those countries. So over 130,000 companies globally are captured by this. And it includes what we call scope 3. In other words, those companies have got scope 1 emissions, which is their direct emissions, but they've got scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions of their supply chain, which includes agriculture. So agriculture gets brought into this mechanism. Now, when it comes to Australia, it's clear that the Treasury Laws Amendment Act was passed late last year. It's a framework for climate-related financial disclosures. And this includes scope 3 reporting from 2027. So we know that agriculture will be caught up in the value chain reporting, which is why we then worked with government to say, well, all governments around the world are realizing the same thing. When I was in New Zealand recently, I realized they've had to face it the same issue, Canada, the same issue. If there is any form of reporting required under legislation, then there must be a standard methodology by which that reporting is done. We can't have a situation where we've got multiple tools that you can choose from, and you could choose a tool that just gives you a nicer number than the other tool. So that's why our government committed to the process of developing a voluntary greenhouse emissions estimation and reporting standard, which we call VEERS. We'll come to a few times in this talk, which covers agriculture, fisheries, and forestry, which is what we're talking about today. So that process is going. It's a joint chair arrangement between the Commonwealth and the new Net Zero Agriculture CRC, where we're adding the science expertise in with some of the constraints around national reporting with the Commonwealth to come up with an agreed standard. So if you go to the link at the bottom, you'll see this table about the phased in of this mandatory reporting. So as of the 1st of January 2025, it's only really the largest corporations, so 500 million or more, or 1 billion in assets, that that are captured, but it does phase in over time, as you can see, so that by July of 2027, Group 3 will come in, which is all corporations of 50 million or more in size or 25 million in assets. That kind of implies that by then, that's most of the agricultural supply chain that is then captured in this, which means we'll be reporting. So what's important is to understand what we'll be reporting. And so I'll now go into, well, how does it work? What are the principles sitting behind carbon accounting? When we talk about a carbon account versus a carbon emissions intensity or carbon footprint, they're not the same thing. A carbon account is the total emissions, the net emissions from a business unit. I think of it in terms of, is it per boundary of the business? So you can think of an ABN as being a boundary of a business where there might be two physical properties and you're moving animals between the two or moving equipment between the two. That's one business unit that comes into a carbon audit. So it's total greenhouse gas emissions from a defined boundary around the farm enterprise, minus the annual change in soil and tree carbon. We'll come to that again in a moment. If you think about what a carbon footprint is then, it's just changed the denominator. The numerator is the same. So we wanted to know what is the net emissions, what's all the greenhouse gas emissions from the boundary of the farm enterprise required to produce the product. But it's divided by the product, not by the area or the business unit. So this is emissions per unit of wool produced or per kilo of meat or per kilo of milk solids produced. Now, this is important to understand the distinction when you talk about a carbon footprint, which is typically what the supply chain are buying, as opposed to a carbon audit, which is the emissions from the property. So what are the principles that we use? There's certain key, you probably won't find this articulated very carefully anywhere. This is something over time we've had to say, well, what is the logic of how a carbon footprint would work? And we are starting to see international documents come through now from OECD, from the European Union, from various governments to say, yes, we agree. This is the basic principle of how a carbon account should work. So we're interpreting what that is. And this is really what the VIAS process is looking at and saying, well, first and foremost, you've got to use the IPCC approved national greenhouse gas inventory for the country you're in when you're doing the carbon audit. Because Australia's put a lot of time and effort into refining emission calculations, emission factors in their greenhouse gas inventory so that we have differentiated emission factors for various nitrous oxide sources. We have a different calculation to the IPCC's default for livestock methane emissions, for example. All of this is quite important because it's local research that has validated what those must be. But by its nature, a greenhouse gas inventory is a top-down. You've got a team in Canberra responsible to use nationally aggregate data to predict what the emissions, how many animals there are in the Northern Territory. Good luck with that. How many fertilizer is applied to various industries? Well, that's tricky. So it has to be done nationally because you can't afford to go and actually collect all the data individually from every farm. But we're moving into a different world now where bottom-up is actually of relevance now, not just top-down. So we have a top-down methodology, but we need to look at it and say, all right, if that methodology is across the whole of New South Wales, what is it on an individual farm? How do we change the question to make it relevant to a bottom-up audit on a farm? I'll give you a simple example. In the national inventory, it would say something like 30% of the New South Wales land area gets enough rainfall to leach. So therefore, we apply 30% of the leaching factor to New South Wales. When you're going bottom up, that question is yes or no. Does this farm get enough rainfall to leach, yes or no? So there's a lot of modifications that were needed from the top down that then become logical to ask the question bottom up. Another one that's relevant is in dairy, for example, the inventory says this proportion of dairy effluent went into the pasture and went into a fixed pond, went into a dry lot. That's a whole national average factor that's used. On an individual farm, we ask you what it is. How much of your effluent went into the effluent pond? And that would vary depending on the kind of farm you're on. So you've got to change the question to be bottom up, but it still is entirely relevant and consistent with the national inventory. But then we've got to be reporting down international supply chains. And so we've got to be aware of what principles are emerging, what our multinational corporations might require in terms of their commitment under the Science-Based Targets Initiative. What is the framework for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol? Now, we keep getting reminded that these are not perfect documents, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Target Initiative. But as far as possible, as far as we can, keep alignment with the national inventory, but also consistency with the various international reporting standards, because I get replies from foreign governments, the Netherlands, for example, wanting to know, well, why didn't you include all these 22 criteria that you should have included in your tool? And then we've got to be able to prepare to say, well, that's because we need to be first consistent with the national inventory. But another reason why we don't use all the 22 scope 3 factors that might be required by an international market is because we have to put it in a pre-farm to farm gate life cycle assessment framework. So now you have the greenhouse gas inventory, you've adjusted it to bottom up, but you also have to put it in a, what does the farmer take responsibility for? Well, what they take responsibility for, what they buy, what they use on farm, but once it gets to the farm gate and it's transported down to the abattoir or to the processor, they can't take responsibility for that too far down that supply chain. So we stop at the farm gate typically. Now that would be informed by ISO standards. So ISO 14067 and ISO 1440 life cycle assessment, which says take your audit, make it consistent with the inventory, align it with international protocols, but put it in a life cycle assessment framework. Now, it sounds very complicated, but that's what we've done in a lot of the tools that you would be using. Now, why do I mention LCA? Because when an international supply chain come back to you and say, why haven't you reported on all 22 of these tick boxes I've got on my list? You say, well, LCA rules say that if it's less than 1% of a farm's footprint, don't chase it too far because you're not actually making a material difference. So in the GAF tools, for example, we don't list all 22 scope 3 factors. We only list the ones that are more than 1% of a farm's picture. So hopefully that makes sense. There's no point in asking farmers to put in gypsum into the tool if gypsum doesn't make more than 1% of the farm's picture. You're asking them to report on the unnecessary stuff. But then we annualize this. We say, well, that's fine. Some of our production systems like sugarcane has an 18-month return. Some of our livestock systems are 18 months to get steers to market. And we have to report on an annual basis. So what we tend to do is annualize. In other words, we do 18 months worth of data into the calculator, divided by 18 times 12, you've got your annual footprint. That sounds very complicated, but actually that might be the logical way forward for some production systems. In the case of crop rotations, we might have to do a full crop rotation of wheat into permanent pasture, into pulse crop, back into wheat in order to get the full picture. So it does become logical as to what you do. And what seems to be emerging now, this is not government policy, it's not VIA's, the voluntary standard, but it seems that because of high variability in Australia, the audit can change between years. If you're trying to do livestock audits in Northern Australia, you'll realize most of the time they are either destocking, decreasing numbers in anticipation of a drought, or rebuilding animal numbers post a drought. And so you don't have a stability there. And so some sort of running mean is going to become more important over time, that at least one full crop cycle or at least 5 years of running mean data in a livestock system to capture what's really happening. So that's a conversation we still have to have about what that logic will be. Now, when we report it, what international reporting seems to require is separate reporting for what we call scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So you'll see in the GAF calculators, we've got scope 1 in the first box, scope 2 next, scope 3 last. Scope 1 are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So on a farm, that's methane from the cows. That's nitrous oxide from the fertilizer you applied. That's methane from the effluent management system, the manure management system. Scope 2 is what we call indirect emissions. These are emissions that didn't happen on your farm. They happened in the power station in the Latrobe Valley or the Hunter River Valley. But they happened because you consumed electricity on farm. So because of that consumption, you inherit that emission. partly because one of the future options is for you to go off grid and go solar, for example, or to put more renewable energy on the farm so that you don't have that scope 2 emission. Now, obviously, in Australia, the further remote you go in towards Central Australia or the Northern Territory, the less farms actually even have scope 2 emissions because they're not grid connected at all. And then you get the scope 3, which some people say is unfair, but actually is really important, and I'll explain in a moment why. These are indirect emissions that occur as a result of the value chain. So they would be pre-farm inputs or post-farm inputs to the farm, to the product. Typically, we don't go post-farm, so that would be on a case-by-case basis, whereas pre-farm, we say, well, what did you buy into the farm? If you bought steers into the farm, who was taking responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions before they arrived? Did you buy carbon neutral steers? If you didn't, you inherit that. If you buy urea fertilizer, you're inheriting the emission from the urea fertilizer manufacturer. If you buy glyphosate, you inherit a fairly high footprint until you phone up the supplier and say, can you give me carbon neutral glyphosate next year? So the whole purpose of scope 3 is to start the conversation about buying preference. And it really goes down the track of saying, phone up your fertilizer company and ask them, can you supply carbon neutral urea, yes or no? And when are you going to do that? Phone up your chemical manufacturer. When are you going to supply carbon neutral product? Change who you buy your steers from. Now, what becomes obvious on this list is scope 1 and scope 2 largely exist in the Australian National Greenhouse Gas Inventory method. So we rely on that for those methodologies. But if you think of scope 3, some of our scope 3s like the emissions embedded in urea manufacture, they were in the Chinese inventory, not the Australian inventory. They are in the Canadian inventory. They're not in the Australian inventory. Or glyphosate is not made in Australia. So we've got to bring that in from other data sources. And so this is where we, in a lot of our discussion, we're saying, well, we need to centralize those so we're all talking, no matter what country you're in, we're using the same database. And that's where a global database like EcoInvent and the Australian subsidiary of that, which is the AusLCI database, we should be continually feeding into those and drawing those assumptions out of a common understanding so there's no misapprehension about what they should be. So that's where we're at in terms of the principles. I thought I would just expand. Some of you have seen this, but I think it's worth expanding what we mean by scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1, I said, are direct emissions on the farm. So that would be methane from the cows, the sheep, nitrous oxide from fertilizer or livestock urine, or carbon dioxide emissions from the consumption of diesel, or carbon dioxide from the application of lime on the pasture. Scope 2, I mentioned, would largely be electricity emissions or energy consumption. So that would be buying natural gas, that would be buying in energy from the grid. So the emission occurs in the Latrobe Valley or the Hunter River Valley, but occurs because you consumed on farm. And then scope 3 in a farm is anything you consume, the pre-farm manufacturing emissions of a product that you consume on farm or use on farm. So that would be buying in urea, massive amount of natural gas used to make ammonia and make urea. Same with glyphosate. Methane from animals that are raised on another property that you inherit. Or if you're feeding grain, for example, you have to inherit the pre-farm emissions of the associated with growing the grain on a cropping property unless they are selling you carbon neutral grain. That's where the conversation occurs to eliminate those over time. Now, the fourth principle we started looking at more recently is saying, well, if a farm only produces one product, that's fine. But there are farms that produce co-products. In other words, a sheep production system will produce wool and meat on the same property from the same animals. How do we allocate between those two? How do we allocate when on a dairy farm, the red meat industry is harvesting bulls out of that dairy farm, but actually the purpose of that dairy farm was to predominantly produce milk. And so we use various allocation methods that are agreed by industry to decide on how to split that. I've given you one example, protein mass allocation we use to say how much protein was required to grow a kilogram of wool, how much protein was required to grow a kilogram of prime lamb. Let's use that proportion, that mass proportion, to split the emissions between the two and report them separately. Nothing's perfect here. You can't do it on an economic basis because that's spurious. but you could do it on an energy basis or a protein basis. Same with the mass allocation of dairy bulls. We say, well, how much protein was required to produce a kilogram of milk solids? How much protein was required to produce the dairy bull? So 15% of the emissions of that dairy farm are now allocated to the bull that might have gone into the red meat industry. That's how we split it in the calculators. Here's the tricky one for a lot of people that they don't realize. If you have generated carbon credits and you've sold them off to the mining industry or to big industry, you have to deduct that out of your farm account because you can't double claim. You can't claim to be a low carbon account when the mining industry might be using your carbon credits to retire them against their obligation. As far as the atmosphere is concerned, that would be double counting. So if you are generating carbon credits and selling them, we have to deduct it out of the final carbon audit on your property to be consistent. Now, I keep showing this diagram that Alison Kelly came up with from Agriculture Victoria as part of the Agriculture Victoria emissions pilot. I think it's pretty useful to use as a way of explaining this to everybody. If you start second from the left, we've got Scope 1 emissions from manure, from enteric methane from the animals. You've got Scope 1 emissions from fertilizer use, from dung, crop residues. You've got Scope 1 emissions from energy, lime and urea on farm. Those you can all then deduct from that sum of Scope 1 and possibly some Scope 2 around energy, the annual change in soil and trees. Really important to get that you can't claim the entire tree. You've got a wattle tree standing there that you planted. Yes, it's growing and it's storing a lot of carbon, but that's a stock, not a flux. What we can count is only the degree by which that tree changes every year. Otherwise, we are double counting that carbon stored in the tree. So the tree's there. If it's mature and it's not growing anymore, it's not changing every year, you can't count anything. You can only count the degree by which it changed as a result of your management. And then on the left-hand side, we bring in the Scope 3. So it says, what did you buy into the farm like fertilizer that was required to produce the product out the right-hand side? What did you buy in glyphosate? What did you buy in steers into the property that then allowed you to produce the product? Because that's part of the carbon footprint of the product you're selling. Hopefully that's clear. Now, what that does, when you pull that all together into a methodology, a number of the calculators available will produce these various ways of depicting it. So you've got dairy in the middle rangeland beef in the middle, where there's not a lot of nitrogen being used. So it's predominantly methane in that audit. Whereas you've got dairy on the left that uses a fair bit of nitrogen, brings a lot of supplementary feed into the farm. So proportionately methane is less, even though per cow it might be more than the rangeland beef system. Proportionately it's less at the picture of the dairy farm because there's other sources of nitrogen counted. On the right-hand side, again, you've got a cropping system where there's no methane from the animals. It's just a cropping system. But you can see it's heavily influenced by crop residue return and by pre-farm and on-farm nitrogen. Just show you some others. Pigs and poultry, for example, there's not a lot of emissions from the animals themselves. So it's mainly from the manure management that you see, either nitrous oxide and methane from manure management in poultry, or mainly methane from manure management in pigs. Cotton, on the other hand, is a bit like the grains industry, very dependent on nitrogen fertilizer. So most of their emission profile is to do with nitrogen. Rice, on the other hand, if you're flooding rice for the full period of growth of the rice, then what you've got is an anaerobic pond, effectively, with organic material in it generating methane from that anaerobic digestion. So that would be a point of focus in the rice industry. And it leads you to these types of calculations that industry are now using as benchmarks to say, when we start reporting, what is the average emissions exposure we have in our portfolio? I would caution against comparing between industries, because a kilogram of wool is not the same as a kilogram of lamb, which is not the same as a litre of wine or a kilogram of milk solids. That's a spurious comparison as far as I'm concerned. But what you can do is look left to right and say, what is a 0.1 wheat and what is a 0.5 wheat? Well, the difference is 0.5 is probably a higher rainfall region where they're putting on more nitrogen fertilizer and probably going a little high on the nitrogen, whereas a 0.1 would be your very arid, low rainfall wheat system in Western Australia putting on 30 kilos of nitrogen. You could argue that with perennial horticulture, for example. Bananas uses more nitrogen than nuts do. Almonds use very little nitrogen on a hectare basis. Annual horticulture goes from 0.04, where it might be very little nitrogen used, to almost 4 kilograms of emissions because they're using 400 kilograms of nitrogen on a lettuce crop. So really a lot of it can be explained in terms of input efficiency. And so the scope to move is within this bound. Now, it's not current policy, but when you talk to industry about how they see reporting initially, they're looking at this type of data saying, can we get an average figure for beef producers in Western Queensland? Can we say that the average beef producer in Western Queensland is a 15, and we'll report on that basis? It might be that they go from a 10 to an 18, which some might get a free ride and others might get penalized, but initially it might be the only way forward. So that brings us to a number of the carbon accounting tools. I'm showing my age here, but we started building the first carbon GAF tool calculator about in the year 2000, I think was the first that we produced the dairy and grains ones back in 2000, when nobody cared. Now everybody seems to care and has an opinion on what's in these calculators. But what we've done over time is try to, as new policy emerges, as new technology emerges, can we keep them as updated as possible to the emerging global environment that we're facing? And so you've got greenhouse gas abatement tool frameworks that cover the industries in the blue box. But a number of third-party platforms that have now come in to say, well, can we take all these tools and put them into one online software environment? That's what Agriculture Innovation Australia have done in their environmental accounting platform. So it's taking all the GAF tools, putting them into one. Now that makes sense in some respect, because then you've got one constant transport module or one constant energy module or one constant fertilizer assumption across all of them. That does make sense. You've got the Ruminati platform, which has basically taken our cropping calculator, our various livestock calculators, and built them into a single tool. You've got the MLA calculator that has the same. You've got dairy that produced the Dairy Greenhouse Abatement Strategies calculator, and from that, the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, and now has taken that calculation and built it into the dairy database. So sitting behind DairyBase is the same tool. Now, while we're on that, there is a view that there are too many calculators out there, so it's confusing. I will point out that all of these calculators here, including Hort Carbon Info, have all sat down and developed themselves together based on the GAF tool framework. So we spent a fair bit of time, for example, with Hort Carbon Info, making sure that the horticulture GAF tool and Hort Carbon Info say the same thing and use the same assumptions. So just be careful of people who say we're not getting the same answer. You've got to first look at, have you actually answered the question in the same way? Because these calculators might ask you a slightly different way, it might ask you the question, but they are based on the same technology behind. CSIRO produced the fine print calculator, which really focuses on the grains industry, has a bit more resolution on the grains industry, and the Cool Farm tool, which I am assured has now been updated to the Australian inventory method. So we could say we're in a world where these tools are all converging on an agreed standard methodology in anticipation that VIAs will actually be going down that track in the future and saying, well, let's avoid the difference between tools by the only question you ask before you use a tool is your tool 100% compliant with the VIAs standard, or does it align with the VIAs standard, yes or no? Now, to shift gear a little bit towards the end, is really to say carbon sequestration, it's kind of a fundamentally different question we're asking. Let's appreciate that for a second, because to know what your soil carbon, why your soil carbon is 4% today, you need to know, did you crop it for the last 20 years? Did you disturb it? Was it under permanent pasture? What did you do 20 years ago to result in 4% to know that whether it can go to 5% or whether it's going to stay at 4%? So by definition, you need to know, if you're counting trees, did you plant that tree as a wattle 20 years ago, in which case it's mature now and it's not doing anything. It's now at the end of its lifetime. Was it a spotted gum you planted 20 years ago, in which case it's still actively growing? So carbon sequestration, by definition, is a much more complex reporting environment. So you'd end up in a situation where it's either direct measurement, take a soil sample, or get someone ordered to come and measure the trees, or have to use a model. Now, for soil carbon, there is an ACCU measurement method published by the government, which is a sampling method for doing soil carbon transects across a paddock to comply with the Australian soil carbon scheme. You can use the full cam model, which does predict soil carbon across the landscape using certain defaults. But it would be conservative in its estimate, or generally right, but not specifically right. There are some sort of simplistic models like the Socrates model, which was produced by Peter Grace. That is just a 5-parameter, fairly simple model. So if you just want a quick look-see to say, is it material on my farm, yes or no? We provide a link at the bottom and left of the page on the Socrates model. Then vegetation carbon, so tree carbon. FullCam is the definitive model for the Australian government to report on its net exchange in tree carbon across the landscape. So that is the definitive model we use. It is based on a more simple 3PG model, but that's not necessarily available. There's some other tools you can look at, like Planner, which is the nature repair market, or Look-See. The thing you've got to look at with those tools is, with Look-See, for example, it looks at your farm and assumes there's nothing there. It says, I'm not aware of anything on this farm. What I'm answering is, if you had to do a carbon project on this farm and you planted eucalyptus nitens in a high growing region, this is the amount of carbon you can sequester in 25 years. So it's giving you the potential of that particular soil by area combination for a carbon project. How that translates to what you actually have on the ground is up to you to then decide. What we have done in the GAF tools, the spreadsheet tools, is run the FullCam model extensively across the whole country and come up with 500 various growth curves, of 100-year growth curves that are sitting in the GAF tools. So if you want a 5-minute answer, that's where you go and you say, well, I'm in northern New South Wales and I'm on a red soil and I've planted a fast-growing eucalypt and therefore have X number of tons, and this is how old it is. Various levels of resolution, as you can see. If you want the definitive answer, you probably go to FullCam or direct measurement. If you want an estimate, you probably go to the GAF lookup tables. Now, towards the end, I thought this was circulated just a few days ago, and it's an OECD report that I thought was quite useful, and it's the 8 building blocks of measuring carbon footprints. And why we put it up is, when we looked at this and looked at it compared to what we're doing in the national standard, there was quite a strong alignment that it needs to align with the reporting standards and guidelines in the country. It must be science-based methods for estimating emissions, and that's exactly what our inventory is. We can only change our greenhouse gas inventory if there's published peer-reviewed science in Australia that says what the change should be. Can we produce farm-level tools so farmers can get access to these bottom-up audits, or supply chains or value chains or regional consultants can access? Can we have databases available of regional data that would be suitable to populate these tools? And in some ways, that's what the inventory does when it provides you with tables of crude protein, for example, average crude protein in a region. That's what we're trying to do there. But there's a lot more work to be done on those regional databases. Can we have a mechanism by which the carbon footprint data can be transmitted with integrity and quality down to the supply chain? That's the whole discussion around, do we use blockchain and QR codes and all sorts of security to make sure there's no corruption of the data in what is generated on the farm down to where it's used down the supply chain to justify carbon footprints. But also the integrity. We've got to work on both sides of the integrity, because as you would know, if you don't know how many animals you've got and you're doing a carbon audit, well, garbage in, garbage out. So actually getting the integrity of the input data is just as important as the integrity of the calculation. Obviously, keeping it low while we scale up the whole area of needing more carbon footprints is quite important. And then keeping it updated, the methodology updated with new science and technology. One of the technologies could be, how can AI help us with carbon auditing, which I'll come to on the second last page. So just to wrap up, there's a few future challenges I thought I'd throw out here.
One is, can greenhouse gas accounting integrate into existing farm software? We really don't want farmers to have to double enter data. If they've got it sitting in a database somewhere with their consultant, and that's what we did with DairyBase. We identified the DairyBase had all the questions asked that were required to complete the dairy greenhouse abatement strategies calculator. So we just buried the methodology in there. So let's not ask farmers to double enter if we can get away with it. Can the value chain report district averages, at least initially? In the first few years, while we're trying to get this mandatory reporting right, we might need to use district averages, like what is the average emissions intensity of a livestock producer in Western Queensland? Can you report them as a 15 as an average? Where do we get the data from? Because that's kind of really hot hen's teeth data at the moment. Nobody's got that data apart from those that are running calculators. And there's inherent in that some that would be advantaged by that, by a district average being lower than what their actual farm is doing. But there'd be some that would be penalized by it and would want to differentiate themselves and say, no, my farm is more efficient than the district average, so therefore I want a bottom-up account. Can we use surrogate data? I'll give you an example. We were working in one of the Pacific Island countries where we said, so what's the methane emissions from your dairy industry? And they said, we don't know how many dairy cows we've got. But when we went to the district veterinary offices, they knew exactly how many vaccines to order for the dairy herd. So that was a clear example to us that actually sometimes there might be surrogate data sitting out there that we are not aware of. We're not asking the right question to get that data. And the obvious question is, can AI help us here? And then there's quite a high demand to start building mitigation options into these tools. So a lot of people that use the tools are saying, can we have nitrification inhibitors built into the tool? Well, the science is there, but can we do that before the inventory does? Because then we're no longer compliant with the inventory. So whose word are we taking on whether this is a high integrity calculation or not? These are all questions we still have to face. So to finish off, we know mandatory reporting is coming and it'll include agricultural reporting. It might be district averages to start off with. But it's really important for us because 73% of Australian agriculture is export focused. And so some alignment with what the future value chain are wanting for market access becomes important. And the good news is the government is developing a voluntary greenhouse gas estimation reporting standard. It's in inverted commas standard because nobody agrees that this is actually an ISO type standard. It's not an ISO 14001 standard in that sense of a standard. This is actually just a guideline or a framework. And so that'll make it simpler for us to say, let's pick a tool based on its alignment or agreement with the standard. So that brings me to the end. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rich. Very informative. There's a lot of new information in there and just goes to show how quickly these fields continue to develop both nationally and internationally. So thanks again for that great overview.
So Ben asked a very popular question, if everyone can see it in the chat, about Farmer A purchases steers from Farmer B. How do we know there's no double counting? You got to remember that farmer level accounting isn't about double or single accounting. That's the national account that does that. And so in the national account, those steers are only counted once. That's actually the total greenhouse gas report. When it comes to what is the carbon footprint of this product, then the emissions of that farmer that sells to Farmer A have to come into, this is the total of greenhouse gas emissions required to produce this product. Now, Farmer A still has, the producer still has to account for their greenhouse gas emissions as we are a business that's selling steers. So until they do what Jigsaw Farms does and covers all the emissions and can sell carbon neutral steers, they are still accountable for those as a farm business for the first 100 days. Now, if they account for those by buying offsets, then Farmer B doesn't have to inherit them because they are fully neutral by the time they transfer across. But so Ben, it's a complex thing, but it's not double counting. It's actually because the definitive account sits in the national inventory, not at this level. This is a level that says, what is the emissions embedded in a kilogram of beef that came off this farm? or what is the embedded emissions of an operation producing steers in the first place. So while it seems like double counting, actually, no, it's not double counting in terms of the product. Hopefully that does make sense, but it's not a scope. It still remains a scope 3 for the business that buys it.
Thanks, Richard.
And suitability, these terms of usability and ease of use of farmers. That's a really vexed question, because there's all the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and carbon account. And when we talk about carbon farming, we actually give the impression we want less carbon, when in actual fact most farms we want more carbon, not less carbon, if you're literal. So there's a lot of work to be done, we would recognize, in translating this language into farmer speak, because when we do a carbon audit, we're not actually adding carbon, we're adding non-CO2, we're adding methane and nitrous oxide is actually what the carbon account is adding together. So I think we're guilty of very confusing terminology when it comes to farmers. So I think it might be up to the stage 2 participants to have some, of the CFOP participants have some discussion around, well, how do we communicate these to farmers without the complexity, but with still understanding what their scope 3 is, because they're going to experience some of these terms in their supply chain reporting. I don't know if I've even explained that correctly, but I think I'm agreeing with you.
No, and thank you, Richard. And I definitely agree with you. It's it stems, the question I pose stems from questions coming through from some of our farmer attendees at our events who are they're wanting to go the next step and say, okay, I get this carbon farming stuff now, but which calculator should I use? Who do I go for more support? Have you got a list of all the info I need to put in so that I can go back and make a start? So I think there are some, templates and tools and things out there, but I think there is a bit of a way to go in terms of translating some of this into more, usable terminology and support for farmers to actually go in and get started in terms of collecting their information and data and so forth.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. It's, we've produced input templates, but they're literally just a printout of the input sheet on the GAF tool. It really doesn't say, what are we asking for? When we're asking for steer numbers in June, July, August, we want the average, not the beginning weight, not the end weight. Nuances like that. They're very difficult to come by. Kathy, I'll get onto yours. For dairy farmers, ask how much they need to worry about starting to crunch their individual farm numbers. Reasoning gets quite conflicted. On the one hand, supply chain needs reporting their scope 3, with some processors paying incentives and split pricing. Others, a chance of national reporting focus shifting towards a top-down reporting. What message would you give to farmers? What I'd give to farmers is there's a bit of an awareness going that, if you think about it, most of this is starting to happen by 2030. And then you go back, you say, well, we got 5 years. Well, do we? Because actually you need about 5 years of running mean data to prove your point, because of the variability we see in the climate. You could have a high number one year because of adverse seasonal conditions, and a low number the next year because La Nina kind of came back. And so it almost puts a wake-up call saying D-Day is 2025. Now, does a farmer need to know their carbon audit in 2025? No. But what would be amiss of us is to say, not communicating to them what data do you need to calculate it retrospectively if you needed to. So the message I would get out to farmers is, if you don't want to calculate your carbon audit, at least know what data you should be keeping with what integrity leading between now through to 2030, so that if you had to do a 5-year retrospective calculation, it can be done. So that's the message I would say. I think, I don't know if Penny's online and has an official view on that. That's not the government's view. That's just my view on reading the tea leaves about what the supply chain are facing.
Hi, Richard. I'm hoping you can hear me and see me.
just maybe to respond to that is one of the things we are hoping to do through the VIA's work is once we develop, these are the equations that you should, this is how you do it, is to come up with a list of key data, a nice summary of key data, but also the standards should hopefully then include, that sort of information Richard was talking about, what the descriptive information to make sure that everyone's putting in the same data, because that is often why a calculator's giving different answers. It's not because the equations are different, it's because people have interpreted what the inputs required are differently. So we're hoping through the standards we can drive that consistency in understanding what the inputs are, and then also hopefully providing that in a summary form as well. That makes it a bit easier for people to know what they should start collecting.
It's a really important point Penny just made there. People talk about the dairy calculators not giving the same answer, but when they go into the one, it asks you an annualized question. The other one, so it's calculating annually, whereas the other one's calculating seasonally. And so straight away, you're not going to get the same answer because you're answering the question slightly differently. The inventory works on a seasonal. The one says, tell me what you fed. You fed kilogram of grain and you fed some pasture, and it assumes your diet composition in the background. Whereas in the GAF tool, we just ask you, what's the crude protein? What's the energy you fed? Straight away, you're going to get a different answer out of those two because the input data is different. So that's why the VIAS process becomes so important to say, how do we get a listing of the required input data correct? Sarah asked, do you have any knowledge around where the range of ag software packages are at in terms of calculating a farm's baseline emissions intensity with no or little extra input required to what these programs are already capturing? Unfortunately, Sarah, if you look around at calculators, the probably dairy base is the closest to that, where the 1,000 dairy farmers that had their data sitting in dairy base, all the data was there required to run the greenhouse accounting framework tool. So that was very seamless and obvious. Most of the other tools are requiring primary input, like the Ruminati, the MLA calculator, the FarmPrint, the GAF tools. But I am aware of a number of major software houses, probably can't mention the names of them, but these are major software houses for agricultural software that have taken the GAF tools and built them in the background. Now, that's where we need to land eventually, except the only difference is we want that calculation centralized so that a government can ensure the integrity of that calculation. And then all the software tools talk to that engine because they've got the data required in their commercial software, so we don't have to re-enter data. So I would say there's a lot of data around baselines and emissions intensity already calculated. If they are aligned with where the GAF calculators are, that list I put up on the screen, they should all be about the same number. So the emissions intensity you get out of the Ruminati or MLA calculator generally aligns with the emissions intensity you'll get out of the GAF tool. So we do a lot of work to make sure that they are the same in the background. Penny, feel free to come on anytime. Rebecca asks, can you elaborate on the challenges and benefits associated with determining district-specific emissions intensity calculation of the emission factors? What more is needed to do this? This is a very big question, Rebecca. We've done a lot of work with some of the major value chain companies, the banks in particular. And by the time we got to 3,000 farm carbon audits, we realized we're never going to get to 30,000. So the question changed to how many data points do you need on farmers within a region, within a population, before you can get a statistical subsample? And generally, it goes like this. If you've got more than 100 subsampled in a region, if you could say 1,000 farmers in the region, all graziers in Western Queensland, not to pick on them, and you've got 100 of them profiled in carbon audits, statistically, that would be a relevant subsample to do a normal distribution of the 5th percentile, the median, and the 95th percentile of that population. Now, with some of these major banks, we've actually achieved that. But then you go to mangoes and, well, there's less than 100 mango growers, so you have to sample them all. we go to potatoes. How many potato growers are there? Could you ever do that? So it depends on the size of the population. If the population is less than 100, you're going to have to do them all, sample them all. Now, this is where I've had some major interactions with consultancy groups waking up to saying, this is a mine, this is a gold mine if we can get this data, but no one's got the data. So we're in that awkward early stage where the early movers do have the data. Hopefully, over time, Penny can comment on this as to whether, you know, some sort of centralized process can self-accumulate data that's de-identified that can then be used to produce district average baselines for reporting purposes. That's a separate question altogether, Penny. Not to drop you in a difficult question there.
That's all right. So I suppose at this stage, the government has a particular program to develop a centralised tool, but there are a number of activities going on with the NFF and the Australian, I can never remember, ASFI, with the Australian Sustainability Framework and those sorts of things where people are looking at how we use data and traceability aspects within DAF as well. So people are looking at how we do traceability and those sorts of things. I suppose what the next step is, you know, how do we then, do we want a central database? I suppose some people prefer that there wouldn't be a central database. Others think it would be a useful idea. So I think the government still, and you know, industry itself are working through those issues about how do you deal with traceability and interoperability and all those sorts of questions. So I think, you know, our focus is on let's just get the equations right and make sure hopefully people are using those in a standardized way. And then I think, you know, as that traceability work builds up, then we might look at more the tool side of things. And it might be a case, as Richard said, the dairy sector has a very comprehensive database of their own sector already. So it might actually be the industry sectors themselves that create those regional or industry sort of averages rather than the government. But our expectation is in that they're using our agreed standards to do that. And that might be sufficient for purposes of, you know, these market chain or climate-related financial disclosure reporting.
Yeah, and dairy is a good example there, Penny. They pretty much do have a valid subsample of the dairy industry. So, you know, that question is almost answered by the industry in that case. So, yeah. And then there's all the privacy considerations, de-identifying data, and, you know, we at the university have taken a policy, we don't collect farmer data because the implications are just too big. So we just stay out of it. Ellie asked, what would your farmer be that are frustrated that some emission reduction activities are yet to be counted in the calculators? With an example of enhanced efficiency fertilizers, what's the point of doing those activities yet or buying low emission products? I'll start off, but maybe Penny, you can come into sort of at what stage can we start recognizing mitigation? You got to remember that some things can be done in the calculators already. Like if you're finishing steers earlier as a result of better feeding practices, well, that's changing animal numbers through the calculator. So the calculator can show you what the effect would be on that calculation. If it's around a coated fertilizer, well, definitely not. We do have industry partners that have gone ahead on the science and said, we're going to do it. And particularly if you're an industry that sells coated fertilizer and dual coated fertilizer, they want to move ahead and do it. The problem they face is who said? Where's the authority on which that is based, or where's the science on which that is based? So that brings us back to a stepping stone that, you know, maybe it does need to be reflected in the inventory first. And this is a valid question, Penny.
Yeah, so I suppose it's one of the things that we're looking at, obviously with the standards, we're keen to get those sorts of abatement technologies reflected in the standards as well as in the national inventory. So as Richard said, we have to go through a process of assuring ourselves that the science is there to support that. Things like the coated fertilizers, well, you know, we have a lot of data about DDMP, but we don't have a lot of data about other nitrification inhibitors. But we're looking at what mechanisms can we, because the inventory can only include something once we are confident of the method, but we also need data to actually implement it in the inventory. So if we don't have any data on the sale and use of these products, then it's not possible for us to include it in the national accounts. So we have to go through a process of assuring ourselves about science, then looking for sources of data. But one process that we are considering in terms of developing the standards is how can we communicate where we think the science might be there, but we're not quite ready to put it in the inventory because we can't find the data. But you as a farmer might have that data, so we don't want to stop you using that science that we believe and have confidence in. So we're looking at mechanisms about how we might communicate that information, whether we do that through our national inventory report or whether we just put it direct into the standards. So that's some of the things that we'll be working through over this coming year to work out sort of those governance kind of issues about how we make decisions about what goes into the standard and into the national inventory report.
I would just add to the last point you made, Ellie, what's the point of them doing these? If you are wanting to trade carbon credits, then there is an early mover disadvantage. But if you're insetting to meet supply chain demand, then it doesn't matter when you moved. So just keep that in mind. If you were a 10 years ago and you're still a 10 now and the district average is 15, you're still going to be preferred. You're still going to be a low emissions supplier. So early mover advantage is not penalized in insetting, it is in offsetting. You can't generate a carbon credit if you've already been doing it for the last 10 years. Whereas if you are a 10 is a 10, regardless, then if the baseline is a 15, you're better than the 10. So just remember that subtle nuance. It's only about selling carbon credits that additionality applies to. Additionality doesn't apply to insetting. Sarah asked about the difference between calculators. There were differences in the grain ones. Sarah, it probably goes back to the 100 farms we did in Western Australia in that pilot that Larissa Taylor coordinated, where we ran the Cool Farm tool, Farm Print, and the grains calculator together. After which I went and sat down with the grains calculator people and we ironed out all the bugs between us and ended up making sure that the grains calculator, GAF, and Farm Print give you the same answer. Subsequent to that, Cassandra Schaff has said that the Cool Farm has been updated to the Australian methodology. So I think we've addressed that problem largely, Sarah. I'm hoping. Kathy asked a certainly common question, how do I compare with the rest? Sorry, just changed. Rest of the region, it's nice to be able to show them with the ADCC. Yeah, dairy is one where there, because of the dairy-based data and ADCC, there is enough data now to actually compare. What we do need to do is break it into systems 1 to 5 in dairy so that we understand, because each of them are going to have a different profile. Joe Sullivan from Kangaroo Island Landscape Board. Lots of questions from farmers about Kangaroo Island and how native vegetation is treated when bushfires occur. This is one for Penny. Are emissions from on-farm native vegetation that have been burnt in bushfires attributable to the emissions of the farm? Is the post-fire sequestration occurring as native veg regenerates counted as sequestration of carbon on that farm? Do you mind me passing that to you, Penny?
You can pass it to me. I don't know quite have the answer. So this is one we will have to work through because in the national accounts, for our reporting for Kyoto Protocol and for the Paris Agreement, we have things relating to natural disturbance where we actually don't report the fire emissions, but we also then can't report this associated regrowth sequestration. So that's how we're sort of operating at the national level. So in terms of developing the VEERs, we'll be trying to look at, well, how do we provide that guidance to operate at the farm level? So yeah, that's a bit of a work in progress. Apologies, I can't give you a direct answer, but it has to balance. So if you are counting the emissions, you can count the removals. If say you don't have to count the emissions, then you won't be able to capture the regrowth sequestration.
I reckon it's entirely fair because you can't capture the benefits and not the detriments. We had the same question in Central Australia where the farmers were saying, 20% of the farm is now down to mulga and it's actively growing and there's millions of tons of sequestration going on because the mulga is increasing. And then I asked the question, so why is it? And they said, well, we had a major dieback in the 70s. And I thought, well, you can count it today if you're willing to take the hit when it disappears again in the next big dieback event. And then that means that on average, there's not much to claim because the losses equal the gains. So same question, I think. It's a bit different to recognizing remnant veg. So that's a lot more vexatious when it comes to particularly some areas in Queensland where there's a lot of remnant veg on farms that they want counted, but actually, if you didn't plant it and you haven't done anything to change its growth rate, then it would have happened with or without you. So you can't really claim it. Is that right, Penny?
Yeah, that's a scenario I haven't thought through. So I suppose in terms of these accountings that we're doing at the farm level, as Richard mentioned before, it's kind of like it's an inventory approach, which is, well, this year this has happened, I have lost something, and then maybe next year it's regrown. We're not trying to do sort of additionality or those sorts of things, but we do, obviously, there's a lot of concern about people, hey, I cut everything down and then I sold the farm, and so the next person can then claim, all that regrowth or those sorts of things. So there are those issues about time and how things have happened. The GHG protocol is hopefully developing some guidance for the land sector, which may give us some insight internationally how people want to deal with this. Unfortunately, that guidance has been delayed now. I think that's been confirmed. It's delayed till later this year, but we will be looking, internationally to ensure that we've got some consistency in the approaches that we might take in Australia, because obviously if farmers are having to report into international supply chains, we don't want to be recommending they do something that's completely inconsistent with what might be being required by their supply chain. So some of those sort of issues about temporal allocation and, I think those sorts of things we will be continuing to work through.
Yeah, thank you. Belinda, the worksheet for gathering cropping data for GAF doesn't take into account water use efficiency, irrigation timing. Is this something being considered? At this stage, probably not. It's not impossible to think of more sort of dynamic approaches in the future, but if you think about where those influence greenhouse gas emissions, we capture it. Because if it's about the extra energy used in irrigation, we ask for diesel and electricity emissions, and that's the only energy required for the irrigation. Water use efficiency is actually captured in the total yield of crop that you put into the calculator. So if you're more water use efficient, you might end up with a higher yield as a result. So the activity data that we capture does capture the influence of those factors on farm performance and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. What it doesn't capture is if you decided to come up with irrigation, well, no, it does capture most of that. The timing, for example, timing of irrigation. We wouldn't be asking that, but the greenhouse gas implications would be captured in the energy used for the irrigation. What's probably not captured is whether you over-irrigated and caused more nitrous oxide as a result of filleting your field for longer. But that's almost a separate discussion that we would love to get to the point one day where we have differentiated nitrous oxide factors, but I think we're quite a way off that still. Penny?
Yeah, I think with the land sector and agriculture, unlike our energy and industrial processes colleagues, there is always a great deal of variation in the emissions sources, and nitrous oxide is one of those. So it really is dependent on that water availability and how, you can get very big variation in the nitrous oxide emissions temporarily between sites, all those sorts of things. So we are stuck dealing with average emission factors, which are based off trials that Queensland University of Technology and Peter Grace have been working on. And, they're large trials, which are quite large compared with other countries, but we still have a significant variation in those. Obviously, we've had people saying, oh, we could use the flux towers and things like that. People have to be aware that if we get to that level of, accuracy in the data, your inventory account is going to have it will demonstrate that massive variation and fluctuation in the nitrous oxide. So at this stage, I think we're stuck with those averages, but as long as they are reflecting and hopefully sending a signal on practice, what is good practice, then that's probably where we want to be at this stage, because if we get to that much more sophisticated methods, it will require more data from farmers, and it has those implications about, well, what does that mean when my annual emissions of varying, orders of magnitude potentially.
I think we can only get to that when you have complete bottom-up reporting of all farmers reporting upwards. Then you can say, well, we can differentiate between a Gippsland dairy farm and a Northern Riverina dairy farm. Because currently there's no data. In fact, the question on inhibitors is also similar to that. We know how much nitrogen fertilizer was delivered to the Kyabram depot of the fertilizer company. We have no data suggesting where it went, how much went to orchards and dairy and all that. That's assumptions we have to make in the background. So the poor person in Canberra trying to do the audit has no idea of the activity data beyond total fertilizer sales in a region. And this is the challenge between top down versus bottom up. Bottom up, you know how much nitrogen you put on. So this is the challenge. Barbara asked a very topical question. If additionality only applies to offsetting, not insetting, does it mean you don't need a registered carbon project? Yep. If you follow the international rules that are emerging around insetting as a mechanism doesn't require carbon credits, because carbon credits are trading units to trade beyond the boundaries of the value chain. If you are socializing your carbon number within the value chain, that's just an audit that's done between you and your value chain on a mutually agreed basis. So you don't need carbon credits. I actually met a dairy farmer from Wisconsin the other day who'd been paid handsomely for insetting through a US company, using protocols that are very similar to our international protocols. Sorry, Penny.
I was just going to note, probably one caveat to that is under the current climate active requirement program within the Commonwealth, if you want to do the carbon neutral claim, they do currently require that you do any of that through a carbon offsets program. But that, as Rich said, if you're doing it through a company type basis, that's not necessarily required. It's just to caveat that that's how climate active currently works.
Exactly correct. Yeah. Simon just made a comment, I think, about inheriting trees on a farm that just occurred without effort, perhaps should not be counted, but it does sound like additionality. It depends. If you deliberately fenced off an area and allow the regeneration of those trees, I suspect it does count, because your management resulted in those trees growing that wouldn't have otherwise. So it really goes back to the question of, would that have happened in the absence of your intervention, yes or no? So if you actually planted the trees, or you just fenced, like in Victoria, there are areas, a lot of Gippsland, for example, if you fence off a hectare of land and leave it for 20 years, it'll be full of wattles, regardless of what you do, because all the seed is sitting there waiting. If you did that, I don't know, Penny, I would assume that would be your management resulted in that activity, so it is within the bounds of an audit.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have the for the VEERS, we're trying to think, well, how do we provide guidance? So, we already through the ACCU scheme have a number of methods relating to, a human-induced regeneration, and some of that just relates to fencing or removing stock. And so we'll be looking at those methods. While we might not want all the requirements that are needed for an ACCU project, they certainly will give us some information about how best to do that for the VEERS work. But yeah, so those sorts of things are already acknowledged as activities.
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much.
Hoping I haven't missed anybody's by scrolling through the screen, because the screen keeps moving. So if I've missed anything, please bring us back to it, Ross.
I've been keeping an eye on you, Rich. You've got it spot on so far. So thank you. So if there's any final questions, please unmute yourself or put them in the chat. Give you a couple of minutes to do that. It's been a very informative talk today by Rich, and the amount of work that's going on in this evolving area is quite surprising. I mean, it's definitely needed, but it's good to see that there's more alignment between the methods and the way things are being looked at, and the whole checks and balances approaches, where we need to be with this. So it's very encouraging to see that this is becoming something that's quite meaningful, and certainly not some of the more questionable approaches that have been used in the past with misalignment between industries and methods. So that's wonderful. Richard, have you got any closing comments? We don't seem to have any more questions. So
No, I think one of the things that we'll probably need to do when you're working with farmers is make them aware of what data requirements would be there. And I'd probably argue, if you're in the livestock business and you don't know how many animals you've got, maybe that's the point to start off figuring out, because when you calculate your emissions intensity, remember it's another metric of farm efficiency. What sort of constant overhead did I produce for an increased live weight pushed through the system? And so for a lot of farmers, we can actually communicate that, saying, calculate your emissions intensity. If you're a 15, you're probably not getting to the weaning rates you should be getting to. If you're a 0.5 in a wheat production system, you're probably putting on too much nitrogen fertilizer. So we can use this in a communication tool just around farm efficiency, which I think is quite an important communication mechanism. Mo had a question around the beef calculator. Have we got time?
yeah,
Ross?
absolutely. Feel free to unmute
Okay.
yourself, mate.
Unmute yourself and come on. And
Yeah, thanks, Richard. With the beef calculator, the GAF calculator, I'm on the Atherton Tablelands, which is a rather unique area. And when you select the area, all you get is north of the Tropic of Capricorn. So, the climate up here is almost subtropical. We get frost, we get high rainfall, we got red volcanic soils. So, the growth patterns and stuff that we get here is completely different to the rest of northern Queensland above the Tropic of Capricorn. And the selection of trees you can't select either, because they don't exist in, the choice that's here for us doesn't appear on the list. How do we go about modifying that without buggering up the calculator to make it more realistic?
yeah, so there's an unfortunate entry into the inventory, which is the manure management or the manure emissions, which switches at the Tropic of Capricorn to almost double. And so we've had many audits we've done in Camberwell, where the producers in the room decide that they are sitting 150 kilometres south of Camberwell, not Camberwell, just to drop the number. You got to remember that the inventory is top down and generally right, but specifically wrong. Now, to be honest, and this is not government policy at all, but if I was on the Atherton Tableland, knowing that unique system and your nice red soils you've got up there, I would be saying we are a more moderate environment than that emission factor allows for, and I would nominate to be south of that Tropic of Capricorn. That would be just the way I would do it. If, in all honesty, I'd say the environment I'm in has a temperature regime that is more suited towards north of Brisbane on the ranges. That's where I would be going, but that's not official policy, because you are north of the tropic and the inventory says you inherit the higher emission factor. If it's trees, we're aware of that, because by the time we got to 500 growth curves, we realized we couldn't cover all the trees on all the soil types in the whole of Australia in a lookup table. So what we've done is we've gone back 25 years to go to the original algorithms that created the 3PG model that created FullCam in the first place. Penny, this is something we're doing on the side to say, because some smart guy got hold of all our growth curves and said, put them through an R analysis and said, you realize you've only got 5 families of growth curves in there, which is kind of logical if you go back 25 years to where FullCam came from the 3PG model. And so what we're doing is we've got someone working on, can we come up with just 5 generic curves that are adjusted by rainfall and location and soil type that can be just log functions in the model. You've got to remember this is generally right, but very specifically wrong. But it could be just the same uncertainty as looking at a lookup table of FullCam in the GAF tool.
Yeah.
So within the uncertainty of not sitting down and spending 3 months on FullCam to get the right answer, you're going to have uncertainty in the tree growth calculator, and you've just got to accept that that error is there, but it's a general indicator. Sorry, Penny, well, that's completely off topic of government policy, but
And so, Richard, like moving forward, once we have to report to our supply chain, like say for instance, we supply to JBS, are they going to think about, or well, I guess this is crystal balling, but as part of the LPA audit, may they, expect your figures to go into there so that there is accountancy, or it's audited for your figures to make sure that they're correct. Or otherwise you could just tell all sorts of fibs, couldn't you?
Yeah, in particular with JBS, they've accepted the GAF framework that Integrity Agriculture has been running for them. It's a bit more tricky when it comes to kind of that in-setting reporting on sequestration. I suspect that's a much longer conversation, and I know Veers has got to this critical point of deciding, well, how much of that do we go into now? Because you could spend the next 5 years talking about how to get sequestration reports right. Penny, I'm sort of deferring to you here.
Yeah, so this is really the perpetual problem with the land sector, is because of that great uncertainty, so you could say, well, I'm going to report 0 for soil carbon, and you're probably just as accurate as going into a highly detailed model, which is going to vary year to year. In the long term, it might just equal 0, right? So this is the challenge, and we're trying to think, well, how do we balance cost and accuracy? Because to get those, if you're going to do soil carbon measurement, that is very expensive. Versus, well, what is the purpose for needing this data? So if it's climate-related financial disclosures, is it sufficient that you have these simpler methods? It will have a higher uncertainty, but it's about signaling that I'm doing the right thing, I'm putting in place practices. Then you've got maybe your supply chain who's wanting to compare farmer A and farmer B, and then that's where the challenge is, because they're probably going to be more interested in more accurate estimates. But there becomes a question of, well, how much can you actually demand of a farmer? And realistically ask them, you can't expect them all to hire a consultant and pay them, hundreds of thousands of dollars to, get the number perfect, because all that does is it stops action. So people just become frustrated and they say, well, this is just too expensive, too difficult. I don't even want to play, right? So we're more interested in how do we provide methods, simpler methods that if they just really want to signal that they're doing the right thing, they're doing good practice, they can at least reflect that they're doing good practice. That's the challenge we have. And so we're trying to look at, can we look at those different approaches?
Yeah, and what I mentioned about reverse engineering some of the early calculators that resulted in full cam is trying to go down that to give government more sort of options. We're not saying this is right. What we're saying is if you had to do full cam, it might take you 3 months to get the answer and learning a new model. If you had to do direct measurement, well, give you some idea. We sent a team out to Jigsaw Farms, and in 5 days, they measured 1% of the trees on the farm. No one can afford to do that. So you've got the two ends of the spectrum: measure the trees and spend $20,000 in 5 days and get 1% measured, in which case you're still using surrogate estimates, or go to full cam, which is a complex model that probably doesn't know what's on the ground, because you've got to actually tell it what's on the ground. So somewhere in the middle, there's a happy medium that we're trying to aim for, and it might be that we use a similar structure that underpins full cam, but use it in a more simplistic way. I don't know, that's not government policy either.
Well, one thing I was just going to touch on was this bit about the audit. So obviously companies may be asking for that data. So part of the purpose of the VEERS is to say, well, if you are able to say, I have estimated in align with this approach from the VEERS, and you can assure yourself that you've used a calculator or whatever that aligns with that method, then they don't need to check your calculations in terms of the verification. Our expectation is any of the key sort of management or other inputs to sort of say, well, I've planted trees. Well, you might need to provide photographic evidence that you've planted the tree. That might be where the audit focuses on, not the calculations themselves, but to demonstrate that the activity has occurred, and that's where the verification might focus.
Yeah,
jump in there. We've got 2 questions left. One of them is about VEERS. Penny, have you got any indication of when that tool may be in completion?
So what we're working towards is we've kind of said we're going to do agriculture, forestry and fisheries. We are prioritising agriculture at the moment. So we're hoping that we will have, if nothing else, and depending on caretaker of elections and all those sorts of things, we're hoping to have at least draft guidance out for agriculture by the end of this calendar year, with publication early next calendar year. And then we'll start work on the fisheries and aquaculture sort of side of things later this year, with the view to having it mid next year. And then we're still working out how we're going to do forestry and those sorts of things. As I say, we were hoping we would have the GHG protocol guidance to provide us a bit of insight, but that has also been delayed. So we're just trying to work through how we scope the department's work program and what we can start doing there. But that's kind of the rough timelines. I'll also put in the chat the link to our website. If people are interested in the standards work and getting the communiques from our stakeholder reference group, they're published on our website, and there's a little email where you can register an interest in them. So if those new communications or updates about public consultation or of draft, you can register for those. So I'll pop that in the chat for you.
So Ross, Alex's question was a slight nuance on that as to when the current calculators will be available. Now, these are not the calculators that have the VIAs in them, obviously, because that's what Penny was talking about. The VIAs will be available later. But I gave you a list of the calculators that already have the GAF structure built into them. And so you could say the AIA calculator, the MLA calculator, the Australian Eggs calculator, Port Carbon Info, Farm Print, all already available. What started happening is some of them are being built into the background of existing farm consultancy software. So some of your bigger software companies have already taken that on board. Some of them have just built the GAF tools in just as straight from the spreadsheet. Others are APIing out to the AIA EAP tool, Environmental Accounting Platform tool. At the moment, that's the only one that allows an API, like a direct communication from your software to an engine. Whereas we continue to manage, even though those tools are developing, we continue to maintain the GAF tools. Not that they are the definitive tool. We're just trying to say the GAF tools are trying to represent how the calculation should be done, rather than being the definitive tool you should use. So it's a subtle difference.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those great responses, Rich and Penny. Well, if there's no other questions at this point, we're just about at the end of our time. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we really hope that the information that we've shared with you today can be used by you guys for that it's useful for you and your facilitation with farmers and land managers in your role as DQ's trusted advisors. As I mentioned earlier, we are recording this session, and once we've got that recording and trimmed it up, we'll pass that on to DQ for them to coordinate distribution to you guys or access to you guys. And we also, as in the last webinar, we're quite happy to take questions from the grantees via DQ. So if you've got any questions or any follow-up that you'd like to request from University of Melbourne's team, so Richard, Selwyn, myself, and DQ, send those questions through to your grantee organisation. They will then send them through to DQ, and then DQ will pass them through to the University of Melbourne. We're not able to take direct requests, so please put those through your own grantee organisation. So we've got one webinar to go. Well, that hasn't been decided yet exactly what it's going to be. We've got some ideas at this stage. So once we've fixed that, we're assured that up, we'll develop that specifically for you guys, for your grantees, and that will be in later on in March, and we'll keep you informed as we work towards building that for you. We don't have a date at this point or a link. So on behalf of University of Melbourne, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today and for the continued support of DQ in University's role in developing the training package and the facilitation guide for the Carbon Farming Outreach Program. And I don't know whether DQ would like to have make a quick closing comment, but if you do, now's the time.
just reiterate a thanks and thank you, Penny, as well, for jumping on and answering those questions. And again, thanks to Richard and the University of Melbourne team. So yeah, thanks everyone, and see you at the next one.